Welcome back to the Ejaries podcast. This is episode 4. I'm Stephen. We're talking about renewal. Most tenancies in Dubai run for 1 year. When the year ends, the tenancy renews. The Ejaries record needs to renew along with it. This episode is about how that works, what's different from the first registration, and what tenants and landlords need to know about the rules that apply. When the rent goes up at renewal. The renewal trigger. Renewal happens when the underlying tenancy contract is renewed. A new contract for a new term, typically another 12 months, replaces the previous one. The new contract becomes the basis for an updated Ejaries registration. The renewal isn't automatic. The previous Ejaries record doesn't roll over by itself. Someone has to register the renewal. As with the initial registration, this is legally the landlord's responsibility, but practically falls to whoever has the most to lose if it isn't done. Renewal happens when the underlying tenancy contract is renewed. A new contract for a new term, typically another 12 months, replaces the previous one. The new contract becomes the basis for an updated Ejari registration. The renewal isn't automatic. The previous Ejaries record doesn't roll over by itself. Someone has to register the renewal. As with the initial registration, this is legally the landlord's responsibility, but practically falls to whoever has the most to lose if it isn't done. In professionally managed buildings, the renewal happens as part of the contract renewal process. In smaller buildings or with individual landlords, it may take more attention. What's different from our first registration? The mechanics are similar, but not identical. A first registration creates a new Ejaries record from scratch. A renewal updates an existing record to reflect the new contract term. The documents you need are largely the same. The new tenancy contract, the title deed, AMA-rates, IDs, landlord identification or commercial license. Plus, for the renewal specifically, a reference to the previous Ejaries registration. The biggest practical difference is that the renewal triggers the rent calculator check. We'll come to that next. The rent calculator. Dubai has a system called the RERA rent calculator. It's a public tool, accessible online, that calculates the lawful rent for a given property based on the average market rent for similar properties in the same area. The calculator's output is the basis for the rules. Unlawful rent increases at renewal. The rules are tiered. If the current rent is at or above the calculator's market rate, the landlord cannot increase the rent at renewal. The increase is 0. If the current rent is between 10 and 20% below market, the landlord can increase by up to 5%. If the current rent is between 20 and 30% below market, the landlord can increase by up to 10%. If the current rent is between 30 and 40% below market, the landlord can increase by up to 15%. If the current rent is more than 40% below market, the landlord can increase by up to 20%. These are ceilings, not entitlements. The landlord can propose any increase up to the relevant cap. The tenant can negotiate. The cap is the legal limit on what the landlord can enforce if there's a dispute. How the calculator interacts with Ejaries. The Ejaries system checks the proposed new rent against calculator output when the renewal is registered. If the increase is within the lawful cap, the registration proceeds. The new Ejaries reflects the new rent, standard renewal. If the proposed increase exceeds the lawful cap, the system flags the registration. The landlord cannot register a renewal at an unlawful increase. The tenant can refuse to pay an increase above the cap. If the parties cannot agree, the matter goes to the Rental Dispute Settlement Center. This is one of the most important practical functions of Ejaries. It's not just an administrative record, it's the enforcement mechanism for the rent increase rules. The calculator sets the rule. The Ejaries registration applies it. The 90-day notice rule. There's a related rule that matters for renewals. A landlord who wants to increase the rent at renewal must give the tenant written notice of the proposed increase at least 90 days before the end of the current tenancy. If the landlord gives less than 90 days notice, the increase cannot take effect for the upcoming renewal. The tenancy renews at the existing rent. The landlord can then propose the increase for the following year with proper notice. Tenants who are facing a proposed rent increase should check 2 things. First, is the increase within the lawful cap? Second, was the notice given at least 90 days before the renewal date? If either condition fails, the increase is not enforceable. Documenting the renewal. Practically speaking, the renewal generates a new Ejaries certificate with a new contract number, reflecting the new contract term and any change in rent or terms. Tenants should keep the previous Ejaries certificate as part of the tenancy history. Some downstream receivers, particularly VISO-related ones, can reference the continuous tenancy as ORI rather than J. Sync the current certificate. Landlords typically retain their copy of every annual Ejaries certificate for the same reason, plus for tax and reporting purposes. The grace period. There's a practical question about what happens between the end of the old Ejaries period and the registration of the new one. If your contract renews on the 1st of the month and the new Ejaries isn't registered until the 15th, are you covered? In the meantime, the honest answer is that there's a brief window where the Ejaries record shows the previous registration has expired and the new one has not yet entered. For most purposes, visa procedures, dispute, access, the system recognizes this transitional state and accepts the recent expiry as a valid tenancy in renewal. For some specific procedures, particularly time-sensitive ones, the gap can cause complications. The fix is to register the renewal close to the renewal date rather than weeks later. Don't let the previous Ejaries lapsed for a month before you get round to the renewal. What to take from this episode? Ejaries renewal happens when the underlying tenancy contract renews. It's not automatic. Someone has to register it. The renewal triggers the rent calculator check, which is the enforcement mechanism for lawful rent increase rules. The cap depends on how far below market the current rent is. A landlord who wants to increase rent must give 90 days notice before the end of the current term. Less than that, and the increase doesn't take effect. A landlord who wants to end the tenancy must give 12 months notice through notarized legal notice on defined grounds. A tenant who wants to end the tenancy gives notice per the contract. Don't let the previous Ejaries lapse before registering the renewal. The transitional gap creates avoidable friction with downstream procedures. In the next episode, we look at the things that cause Ejaries registrations to be rejected, the common errors, the less common ones, and how to fix each. Thanks for listening. The full transcript is at transcript.a. For Ejaries registration support, .ejaries.a is a operational service.